morning. Thank you for some wonderful presentations, and Noah, your presentation filled me with a lot of excitement. The first three filled me with increasing levels of frustration. So let me just give you my context. So I'm Jonathan. I'm the Education Sector Coordinator for Shawco. We're an organization very much linked to UCT. We're 70 years old. We have 5 community centers that ironically are, Manenberg, Khayelitsha, Nyanga, Kensington. We've got a project in Hout Bay. We currently have over 2,000 kids coming to after-school interventions, utilizing over 1,700 UCT students. For the past 3 years, we've managed to get no funding for any of our programs. The current BBBE, Black Economic, broad-based criteria give no incentives to corporates to actually fund life skills training. It used to be that South African civil society got a lot of training for life skill programs, and I was very interested to see that you guys are saying life skill programs are really effective. It is almost impossible for me to get funding to run life skills programs, and I find that massively frustrating. And I'm not saying government give me money, but if government could be going to corporates and saying, this is what works. So when NGOs are coming to a corporate and say, run life skills programs, they don't get laughed out of, because we used to run education programs, we're still running education programs, but the problem is that we're creating places of safety for learners to come after school, and corporates are saying, show to me that you're having an impact on their maths marks, which is something that I can't do, but I can say that the parents appreciate it, that the schools appreciate it, that the kids are in a safe space, that they're expressing themselves. I can talk about holistic education, and I see the funders just going to sleep as I start to get into that spiel. My second challenge is, given that a lot of our morphology is so youth-centric, it's interesting that we've got representatives from government but nobody from education. And where is the Western Cape education representative in initiatives like this? Especially given that a lot of this is so deeply rooted around schools. And Noah, I want to talk to you afterwards about the whole giving responsibility, responsibly, because I think for a lot of NGOs engaged in community initiatives, I think it's these type of out-of-the-box funding strategies that are holding us accountable and are focused in what is the impact that we're having on beneficiaries, but are giving your average South African a chance to also be engaged in actually improving society. So, yeah.
Yes, good morning. I'm Patricia from UNICEF. Congratulations to all the presenters, really, for all the good work and excellent presentations. I have a very quick question for the first gentleman from the government, from the Western Cape government. I would like to know if you're aware that the Western Cape government, especially DSD, is in the process of developing a youth development strategy. So I would like to know if this also forms part of an intersectoral initiative, how much you are aware of that, and also we will be curious to know more about the ongoing crime prevention strategy, especially in terms of outcomes and results. Because we heard about the broader framework, but not actually what has been achieved and what needs to change in the future.
And the final question in this round is from Carl.
Thanks, Guy. Carl from Monday Football, sorry. Following up from John's question, also, and Patricia's question, social development and their absence from this colloquium, in addition to education, just wondering why. And secondly, this life skills topic that you also brought up, it would be interesting just to get some feedback on what's actually happening in terms of the mod centers where there is in theory a life skills program. What are the results? What is the content? Is it on paper somewhere that someone can see, and are there any results somewhere that someone can actually have a look at and see? So this is what this life skills program is actually achieving, or trying to achieve. And I think the last question is to Noah, any information around dosage, so dosage and change. Do you have any understanding of how much or how many times you need to attend a movie for you to actually not be violent, or how many times you have to attend a skateboard session? And then linked to that, what sort of dosage are you talking about for individuals? If you're able to track it at the moment, and what the results are of that.
Well, let me just hold the questions for now, let the panel, give the panel a chance to respond, and then if there's time, we'll open up for a second round of questions. Can I start with you, Noah?
Yes. So let me start with you, Ian.
I think it's related.
They're all related. So I'm going to say a couple of things that may or may not be contentious. So the first thing I'm going to say is in terms of trackable impact on murder, very little. Let me say that straight out. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is, as I say, the overall program that we're involved in, by definition, is focusing on those areas physically that are not where most of the violence emanates. So if the SAPS figures are right, roughly 40% of the violence in younger occurs in the areas where the focus is. Now, there's some travel back and forth, but if you start adding up even the most successful intervention, the likely possible impact it can have on a murder rate in that area, you're dealing with fractions of fractions. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and my background's in finance. We started to look at the role of social impact bonds, driving innovation, outcomes-based. The Giver platform is all about transparency, but at some level, I think within my mind, the reduction of the role of the state in so many areas. For instance, the reduction of sport being included in education policy, right? So that you have to have a mod center because at any private sector school, you have after-school sporting activities. At a school in younger, you no longer have sporting activities. As that gets reduced, one starts being put on the spot to prove impact from things that are the most basic rights in other parts of the world. So if I characterize yesterday's conversation, some of the pathways to violence, well, it's really useful to have two parents, neither of which are consistently or randomly violent towards you. A good education helps, and some exposure to some pro-social, sporting, and other sort of activities in the afternoon. It's proven by Legion that these are useful. Every single one of those things are now requiring programs to get involved. What's the business case on a library? I've got no idea. So we're not actually making any pretense that what we are doing is going to be locally trackable to a reduction in murder in younger. I'm going to start by not even making that claim. The claim that we are making runs a couple of points. The first is that we have a strong sense that what we're doing will at least lead to the improvement in a sense of safety around that area. And one of the ways that we're planning to track that is that we now have SAPS at a local, a cluster, and in fact at a provincial level quite strongly involved. And we have an agreement with SAPS Nyanga and SAPS Nyanga cluster that as this program gets underway, to the extent they start seeing differences in their figures, both reported and perceptual, they will start feeding those to us. Secondly, this is ultimately a challenge back to city to say you have community centres. There's about 200 of them, plus a whole, couple of hundred sporting facilities. As long as there's a policy to have community centres, let's use community centres for what community centres should be used for, i.e. for the community. And right now there's formally no programming on weekends or evenings out of those community centres. This has ultimately been a very cheap exercise. So in terms of the standards of these things, the overall cost to date of all of our younger activation programming, including this video, is roughly 150,000 Rand spread over 6 months. And it's included a whole lot of experimentation. We've now run maybe 40 or 50 movies. The movies are for free on a deal with Stir Kinnickor. We're putting our local team on EPWP stipend. So at some level, starting to get a robust M&E system in place to measure the pathways starts costing more than the program. Between now and the end of March, Ian, we're aiming to sort of stabilize the experimentation so that we have a program in place. The idea is that in the next year, if this is something that's sustainable, you then start setting up better M&E around what you're doing. This goes to the point about dosage. Honestly, we're not there yet. In fact, the movies are at some level a failure, right? Because we started to tackle 20 to 30-year-olds. 20 to 30-year-olds didn't come to movies, but kids started coming to movies in the evening. We then started having parents arrive to say, please make the movies earlier. So we moved the movies. We now have 2 slots, Friday, Saturday, Sunday afternoon, so that's 6 shows in the weekend. We typically have 300 kids arrive each day. The auditorium can seat 150, so we double up. We have 2 shows. They arrive as young as 6 through to 14 or 15. I've not been to all. I've been to 7 or 8. I haven't seen one parent arrive. Kids as young as 6, never seen one parent arrive. But the feedback that we've got around the value of this has come from 3 points. Firstly, it's colleagues in psychology, ISS, other departments that say, if you really want to start shaping behavior, do something with the 6 to 8 years old. By the time it's 25, it's more difficult. So please, don't step off the program. Our challenge is now to find people who will run programming for kids. So here's a call. 2 to 6, Friday, Saturday, Sunday afternoon, Zolani Center in Younger. We can provide you typically with 150 kids in 2-hourly cycles for people who can actually do programming on the ground. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is the feedback we got is they're not physically in the way of violence. So every hour that you spend inside is 1 hour less that something else might happen. During the times we've been running these programs, on one afternoon there were 15 shots fired at the taxi rank just across the road. On another afternoon, there was a kid beaten to death outside Mapendi's, which is just down the drag, maybe 500 meters down the road or a kilometer down the road. This is where kids sit outside. So it's not even designed to change long-term behavior. Just for that amount of time that they're inside, they're less likely to be killed. And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, they're less likely to observe violence. There was a lot of different, from our point of view, fascinating exposure yesterday about the different predictive models of what leads you to be violent, and a lot of it, unsurprisingly, is about observing. So you're inside, you're watching a movie, there is no developmental benefit to a movie, but the idea is that if this stabilizes, you then start substituting just watching a movie with some homework prep, with some developmental work, with some trauma counseling, because a lot of these kids at age 6 or 8 will have seen stuff that you don't want any adult to ever see. So if we get a chance to stabilize the programming, and a lot of that depends, without putting too fine a point on it, on all the local politics, this should be easy. It isn't. If between now and the end of March we get a chance to stabilize the programming, we can then start looking at, to your point, Cole, what one can do about stuff that's really more personally developmental and will likely mean that in the sample we're working with, and we get some M&E in place at that stage, the sample we're working with starts having more of a likelihood of a different outcome. Even in terms, the final point is just in terms of, frankly, the legality of what we're doing. There's no consent forms for any of the kids that arrive. We can't go through the process of asking their parents because their parents aren't around. That's one of the issues. So there's liability that we take on in managing this process, but the alternative is they're out in the streets. The distribution of movies, Stir Kennecore releases movies. About a third of them go into video. Those are the ones we access. Now, any of these kids have seen pirated movies long before we were able to show them. So right now we're at the point where we're buying movies on our own bat and showing them. We're not replicating. We're not charging. So technically we are in compliance with copyright rules, but it starts becoming a bit of a grey zone. So this is a lot of what we're required to do simply to get stuff off the ground and be a catalyst for city, province, private sector to start doing this. So I think I've answered quite a few of the questions. Let me pause there and hand over to my colleagues.
Maybe I should use one of my lifelines as well and call a friend. But let me first, Jonathan, in terms of the frustration of the funding, and I get that every time, or everywhere, or daily, you understand. And as I said, that's one of the challenges facing, I can only speak of personal experience, but me as a bureaucrat, how do you decide, is it the professionalism of the PowerPoint presentation, of the way that the business plan was written? That's the difficulty. So I hear your frustration, but I can also give you many examples of very successful projects that are supported by government. Some of them in this room, some of them that will be presenting, including the safety lab, you understand. They are fully funded by by provincial government. So again, you understand, yes, I hear what you say, and that is why the Community Safety Act is also, as I said, really focused on how do we as a government become a capable partner. Now, one of the issues that we'll set up a safety advisory committee that's made up of a academic, the law states that, made up of an academic, a business person, a judge or senior counsel, NGO representative, and part of them is also to use this panel to help us in making the decisions as to whether, remember, in terms of the Public Finance Management Act, the accounting stops with a post, with the post that I occupy, or the head of department. But so the advisory council can advise and give criteria, but ultimately it comes down to an individual sadly having to make that decision and also having that accountability. So, and that also comes to the question in terms of the strategy, the youth development strategy, and so on. At least from my perspective, and I think we live in a time where change is a product of just every day. We go in strategic planning sessions on a Saturday and Sunday, and Wednesday we need to start planning the next one because things have changed between Saturday and Sunday. So you understand, we need to increasingly also ask ourselves, how do we as government become fit for change? How do we, because currently we're not fit to change. It takes us 2, 3, 4 years to respond to the needs of our customers, our taxpayers, yourselves, the community, and that we need to see how can we do it quickly. And it's not personal or training driven, it's structural, it's budgets, it's policies, it's so on. And then in terms of the difficult one, Ian, and that's where I may want to call a friend, but I think I did give the warning that I'm oversimplifying, you understand? I think maybe it's also the terminology that I used. I would invite, if somebody feels to respond also from the Center of Criminology. But let's say, at least from our perspective, again, they looked at specific projects. And our brief to them was to say, what is the common denominators in these projects that actually make them successful or not? You understand? And that's where we say fixing the future. Now, I would, from my layperson's perspective, say, well, that is applied in the safety lab. We're not looking at the structural issues that causes murder. We're taking 300 kids off the street. You understand? Now, the cost, again, if you take 5 kids and you put them through a social, psychological process and so on, so it's really about how do we find issues that on a structural level is the low-hanging fruit. Which can we take, which can we adopt, which are the principles that we need to look at, you understand? What are the projects, again, when we support the projects? Are we supporting the projects that are focused on, you understand, let's say, why the last 300 murders were not successfully convicted, or how do we prevent the 300 next murders? Then when we are faced with that challenge, we have to go with the ones that's aimed more at fixing the future. But as I said, you understand, Chairperson, that's a very serious oversimplification. I don't know if any of the friends will answer the phone, if there's any takers. Prof. Cartwright, do you want to add, sir?
Just to comment on the question of best practice and best thinking. I think the term best practice is used very frequently, and it can obviously hold dangers, because what often happens is that you look at something that works in Alabama, for example, and you think, brilliant, let's do it in KwaMashu. And it may or may not work, but there is a tendency to go for best practice, which is a very superficial way of looking at why, in fact, doesn't engage with the question of why is that working there. And if we look at it carefully in Alabama, and see what are the circumstances which tend to make it more successful, can we then look at it differently and apply it in a more sensible way back here? It's a bit of a kind of colonial cringe kind of thing very often. Good, it works, somewhere over there, let's put it in here.
Mm.
So instead of best practice, we just thought it would be a useful part of the kind of rethinking process that Killian's been talking about, to rather talk about what's the best thinking. What are the so-called design principles that we can take and see if they work? And we've done that in practice several times. With Metro Police, something that came from Amsterdam, but had to be indigenized. And because there were things in Amsterdam that were similar, we thought, okay, it's worth trying here. But I could go on, but really that's the distinction. It's just to get us to think more deeply before we transfer practices from place to place and then wonder why they fail.
Chairperson, that's my final answer.
You can proceed to the next round.
Thanks, John.
Can I just get this? Michael, if you want to respond to some of the challenging questions that were posed.
Yeah, quite a few of the questions touched on the absence of the Departments of Social Development and the Education Department. So I'll speak to that. Partly it's a function of the genesis of the violence prevention policy framework. It very much started as part of the Burden of Disease Reduction Project, which is located in the Department of Health, and it was driven through the Injury Prevention Working Group chaired by Richard Matsopoulos under our SO4, which is on increasing wellness. And then as we came to develop the policy, we saw that there was actually quite a lot of resonance between the public health approach to violence prevention and what we call the whole of society approach, which the Centre of Criminology helped us to develop in terms of our strategic objective on increasing safety. In that they're both very much focused on the root causes, the underlying causes of safety and violence, the situational context of safety and violence, and they both very much adopt in public health care, a focus on the upstream factors. They both speak the same language, and so that's why those two departments probably have been the most involved in the development of the policy framework. But that's not to say that education and social development have been altogether absent. On the contrary, how the policy development process works in the provincial government is that sometimes a line function department like health or community safety will initiate a policy development process, and then when a policy has transversal implications, it very often comes to the Department of the Premier, in which the policy and strategy unit is located, for completion and refinement and for transversal consultation. And the way the development of policy pans out is that any policy with transversal implications actually gets aired